Okay, we are recording. So hello, everybody. It's good to see you and that you got here. Oh, yay, Abby made it. We are joined by Allaa, and you've probably read the awesome research that she's doing from the poster on public toilet design. And I know I will just let you take it away so you can do an introduction and then dive right in.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you, Kim. Hi, my name is Allaa Mokdad. I'm joining you from Windsor, Ontario. I'm a recent graduate from the MArch program at Lawrence Tech University. And I've had the opportunity to work both in Detroit and Windsor. I have about 3 years of professional design experience, and currently I'm just doing my own thing. Today's presentation is based on a thesis research that I conducted during my graduate studies, and I hope you enjoy it. So can I take it over from here?
Yep, you should be able to just click share screen.
Awesome. Okay, is everyone seeing what I'm seeing?
I am seeing a really cool graphic with lots
Awesome.
of people. Yep.
Okay, I'm gonna hide this part altogether. All right. I'm just going to start with a quick introduction on what I define the public toilet as. And the design of the public toilet has been a consequence of many factors, including hygiene and sanitation, policy and infrastructure, and social values. The public toilet then has the capacity to become a tool in figuring out how societies function, what they value, and other trade-offs that are made. The ultimate realization of the public toilet is its introduction in the 19th century metropolis as an object of modernity, addressing issues of sanitation and hygiene. The economic boost due to the Industrial Revolution and World War II brought many improvements to the city plan, and beautifying cities for the most part included street furniture and lights, and part of that scheme has always been the public toilet. As it became more embedded in the city fabric, it also became embedded in other establishments as cities grew. And it has shifted from an independent standing design object to one embedded in private facilities, shifting from an exterior urban condition to an interiorized urban issue. The landscape in which the public toilet exists today has shifted immensely from what it initially started out as. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. The development of the public toilet and personal hygiene are directly in relation to urbanization and public health awareness and its relation to sanitation. And please note, this research was conducted pre-COVID. People approach the space from a personal point and are instead met with a much larger social issue. So my approach to this research was an interdisciplinary approach. I analyzed 3 cities, Paris, London, and New York, through the lens of hygiene, policy, and design. And initially when I had done that is because there was lack of literature, there was lack of enough literature on public toilets. So that kind of forced me in that direction, but I was quite happy with the results. So from this point forward, I'm going to go into a deep dive into the analysis, and I hope you enjoy the graphics. The 19th century London grew from a population of 900,000 in 1801 to over 2.3 million in 1850. And these numbers are extreme, and you see it happening in New York and London as well. New York was a commercial hub that was growing at an accelerating rate. in 1810, population increased from 96,000 to 3.5 million in 1900s. London was the leading city in economy, and by 1885, it was recognized as one of the largest cities in the world. It had become the commercial hub of England. But at the same time, workers still lived in slums, and structures dated back to the 17th century. As population grew, sanitation conditions deteriorated, and London was infamously famous, just the same as New York and Paris. And I will mention that the 3 case studies were selected based on a literature review that was done in 1 semester that that identified pressure points in these 3 countries. So they were selected based on the significance of the events that happened in the life of the public toilet. So makeshift drains created a lot of drainage issues. Makeshift drains poured raw sewage right into the streets and lacked basic infrastructure. Early Dutch settlers had called it the standing pools of filth, and they caused intolerable stench to fill the air. This was happening in all 3 countries. And this contributed to a lot of diseases, and later on you'll see how it contributed to waterborne diseases. Unprecedented population growth caused congested streets, and narrow streets in Paris did not receive like any sunlight. And by 1817, there had been over 17,000 carts of waste circulating in Paris. And Paris is the only city out of the 3 that actually had some kind of basic sewer system that dated back to the 14th century. But they were only drainage systems. They weren't what you consider the modern sewage system. So in the 1800s, a common household item was the chamber pot. And it came in many forms, and it was used to hold the waste, and usually it was dumped right out of the window, and that's where the term garde l'eau comes from, which means kind of like watch the water, and that's like the literal translation from French, but means watch your step as like a term of courtesy. The toilet actually was invented by Sir John Harrington, but there's conflicting dates as to like when it was actually first designed. And he published a book called The Metamorphosis of the Ajax in 1596. And he designed the flush toilet. However, it was limited to obviously royals and nobles. Prior to sewer infrastructure, nightmen would gather the waste from homes, and they would dump them right into the rivers, contaminating fresh water and adding to the congestion and poor sanitation conditions in the city. In New York, we also see the same patterns happening. Outhouses were used as toilets. In New York, the biggest issue they had was the belief, the ideology that sewage system was linked to diseases. And this carries out through the entire theme of this presentation, because it really put New York behind in terms of public provision, because it wasn't allowed indoors. They removed waste by shoveling them and pouring them right into rivers. They were also used for fertilizers, but they were also sometimes just dumped at like the outskirts of the city. So there wasn't really any legislations or protocols dictating where they could and cannot be. In Paris, barrels of easements were provided in street corners in an effort to reduce public urination defecation. While privacy in the social realm doesn't really develop at this time, women usually would gather in groups and form a circle, and they would call it picking the flower, and they would provide shelter, provide privacy for one person that was in the center, and they would usually be going on about their business. So I think that's pretty interesting. In the 1800s, Paris was overcrowded and sewage was obviously a problem. It was being dumped right into the Seine River, contaminating fresh drinking water. So policy bans on public urination actually dated back in Paris, back to the 16th century, or sorry, the 1700s. This didn't prevent people from going in the streets anyways, and they were first introduced to protect buildings because the bottom of buildings where the material would deteriorate. It was more of an issue like of that, as well as a hygiene issue. In 1819, the Common Council in New York prohibited dumping waste into the sewage system. Sewer systems at this point intended to drain and not carry out storm water rather than waste. By 1825, the population had grown to 166,000 and water was becoming sparse. It wasn't until 1910 that nearly all buildings had indoor plumbing, but at this point, people were sharing the outhouse, like it was communal. It was usually one per floor or one per 5 or few households. This is not public, but it was the first form of the toilet. New York had become one of the dirtiest cities in the world. In 1844, an estimate of 800 cubic feet of excrement were produced, during which there had been 2 cholera outbreaks, which I'll come back to. And these barrels of easement were used also to defecate in the cities. They were usually placed in like corners. And there was also a person that would walk around with a cloak that offered privacy services, I guess, that would wrap the cloak around you and provide you with that. The cholera, actually, let's go back real quick. The cholera outbreak of 1832 claimed the life of 3,500 victims. There had been a shortage of drinking water and poverty was accelerating and worsening. Up until the by 1850, up until here, they had still thought that sewage were associated with issues. Oh, sorry. By 1850, London had begun to implement sewer systems. The Public Health Act of 1854 brought changes to the water closet as they were now required to be connected to drainage. In the 1840s, social reformer Sir Edwin Chadwick tried to bring clean air and adequate sanitation and minimal standards of living to industrial cities. His report on sanitation conditions of the labor and population of Great Britain was published in 1842, urging to purify dwellings, streets, and the rivers. These changes would involve dispatching London's water in the direction of its water supply. Between the 1840s and 1850s, the landscape of the city had changed as railways were being more invested in the city. And we see that also in New York and Paris, but mostly also in New York. We backtrack. This is 22 miles of railways that New York had added around the same time it was also happening. in London. And at this time, what railway companies were doing was they were trying to get rid of the lower class because it was easier to take over those areas, and they considered it a means of clearance of the working class can benefit from. In Paris, the population had gone up from 547,000 to almost 1 million by 1850, and it had also the reputation of being a dirty city. Paris was facing its first cholera outbreak. By mid-1830s, it had, at the same time this was happening, it had added over 800 meters of sewer systems. Oh, I forgot to introduce it as well. Claude Faber first introduced the public urinal in 1834. It was known as the Pissoir of Vespasien, and it was actually just considered as a sculptural object. These pissoirs provided the fundamental work that George Haussmann later implemented in Paris, and it paved the way for better sanitation provision. This is the night soil era. In 1848, the population in Paris was still growing over 1 million, and unemployment was accelerating. So it led to the French Revolution. In 1848, Louis Napoleon was elected president, later self-elected himself as emperor, had a particular interest in improving the city of Paris. Improvement schemes for the city were considered, starting from the center and working their way outwards. George Haussmann proceeded by improving the plan that Napoleon had devised, and Napoleon actually was influenced by the streetscapes of London. So when he came up with this, it was what he had seen in London and been influenced by. So some of the changes to the public amenities happening in London influenced changes in Paris. Haussmann's work would be part of a program to modernize the cities and obviously beautify the streets. In London, around this time, England hosted the Great Exhibition, which was a turning point for the public toilet. The Great Exhibition was held at the Hyde Park. A plumber named George Jennings installed the monkey closet in the retirement rooms of the palace. He introduced the concept of pay a penny, which were the first public toilets the visitors had ever seen, causing a great deal of excitement. Over 820,000 people paid 1 penny to use the toilet, receiving clean seats, towels, and a comb and shoe shine. The toilets were scheduled to close after the exhibition ended. However, Jennings persuaded some of the organizers to keep them open, which ended up generating roughly £1,000 a year, which was significant at the time. The public toilets that were later implemented, however, were only provided for men, as women played a much smaller role in the social realm. Prior to the exhibition, a flushing toilet was restricted to the wealthy, so this was the first affordable modern technology for people to use. The success of the toilets at the Crystal Palace transcended into the streets as public toilets started to appear in other cities. By 1852, there had been over 95 public toilets. These toilets were called public waiting rooms, and they were all over London and Europe. In New York, not simultaneously, New York Commission in 1870, there wasn't much going on in terms of design in New York, but there was a lot going on in terms of hygiene as the city still lacked basic infrastructure. So New York commissioned Manhattan Odor, this excavation company, pioneered to clean up the night soil to alleviate the human waste. In the late 1870s, cities laid pipes under the streets. City laid pipes under the streets allowed for indoor supply. In 1880, plumbing began to go vertical as well. They were usually stacked, and getting water beyond the sixth floor became an issue, a pressure issue. So wooden tanks were introduced. They sat on top of rooftops, and they were pumped by hand. They held about 10,000 gallons of water, which symbolized a huge milestone in sanitation and public health. So in the early 1800s, all three cities were facing a cholera pandemic or epidemic. In New York, excrements were thrown into the streets, often ending in leaky cesspools and contaminating local wells. This fueled a cholera epidemic in 1849, killing 5,000 people. By the mid-19th century, New York was filled with disease outbreaks, including smallpox, yellow fever, measles, malaria, and a lot more. In 1863, a group led by Dr. Stephen Smith founded the Citizens Association of New York to address issues of public health. They sponsored a survey in 184 areas, revealing the inequity in sanitation conditions throughout the city. And they launched a campaign to improve access to health benefits for the public. The Metropolitan Health Act of 1866 brought these changes and helped tackle sanitation and hygiene issues. In London in 1854, John made the infamous observation of the mortality rate among people using the pump in Broad Street during the 1854 cholera epidemic. He theorized that water from the pipes were being polluted by leaky contaminants into the water. However, Snow's conclusions were dismissed, so he took matters in his own hand and went to the fountain and took a sledge to it. Snow's map is a historic indicative of waterborne diseases, as prior to Snow, the connection had not yet been realized. Cholera remained an issue in congested cities. London would face another outbreak. And by 1858, the cholera pandemic led Parliament to sanction a comprehensive sewer plan by Joseph Bazalgette, that protected London's water supply from its sewage. Bazalgette's sewer plan would ease the way of growth and provide infrastructure into the 20th and 21st century. In Paris, in 1848, another cholera outbreak occurred, killing 19,000 people, sparking huge interest in hygiene and sanitation. Paris legislation was passed to improve public health that would provide inspection and improvements in unhealthy dwellings. While many schemes were in discussion, the improvement of the city conditions, it wasn't until 1853 when George Haussmann was elected to design a plan for Paris. And so the scheme was in works, but it wasn't until 1853 that it was actually implemented. And the top-down approach to implementation of sewer systems in Paris ameliorated a lot of issues to public provisions later on in the century. So in 1872, this marks a huge milestone in the turning point of the toilet. And I think this is when we stopped designing it. In 1872, changes to the design of the toilet occurred due to the Metropolitan Water Act of 1872, which stated that sewage systems should be water-based. In the 1870s, a toilet designed by Crappers flushing system was approved by government and became the standard. This made all the toilets switch from cesspool to flush, which required sewers to be built. So this was a huge infrastructure change, as well as a design change. In 1893, more permanent public toilets were added. By 1895, the flush had improved, and Jennings Company continued to add public toilets in 36 British towns, among other places including Paris, Florence, Berlin, Madrid, Sydney, and South Africa. New York in the 1800s, in the 1880s, the Board of Health passed regulations to oversee all plumbing installations, ensuring proper ventilation, adequate material for piping, and making them accessible for repair. So this was the first time that you start seeing plumbing indoor for everybody, not just noblemen and royals. In 1881, there was a publication called Sewer Gases and Its Dangers by George Preston Brown. Warns the dangers of sewer gases associated with sewers, but that wasn't actually the case. Up until this point, the general consensus was that, but by 1890, New York and Brooklyn had 844 miles of sewers built, ending the era of the night soil men. Whoops, I forgot one more. And the Tenement Act. This is a very important one. In 1901, the Tenement Act was in place, stating that in every tenement house hereafter erected, there shall be a separate water closet and a separate compartment with each apartment. So, huge milestone. The Suffragette Movement. In the 1800s, the Suffragette Movement was in motion. By now, women had been advocating for their rights to access public toilets. It was considered a crucial step in attaining their rights in the public realm. By 1928, a survey was conducted showing provisions in London, and there were 233 public toilets for men and only 184 for women. And this still remains an issue till today. Issues of provision primarily remains a bigger issue for women in general than it is for men. Hence, it attracts more women into this kind of research, I've found, in terms of the authors and everyone that I'm referencing. By 1928, the survey showed that. In 1936, the Public Health Act in the UK granted rights for authorities to provide public toilets and charge for their uses. This was a problem for the suffragette movement because as toilets continued to expand, they made exceptions to the urinals because men did not have to pay. This would be protested by women activist groups later on in the century. By the end of the 20th century, there had been a decline of public toilets for many reasons. But before we get to that, in 1855, okay, so we're just going to talk a little bit about the transformation of the public toilet from a design object to a utilitarian object. And if we look at London, in 1855, the first underground permanent toilet was opened with iron railings designed in Victorian style. Most of the toilets underground dated back to 1884 and 1925. More underground facilities were included later in the 1960s as part of the motorway and pedestrian underpass program. Later versions of the toilet were made of marble, copper, and finished with fine ceramics. But as you move on into the century, they were abandoned, and later in the 21st century, they were converted into cafes and restaurants. In the in the late 1800s, late 1800s, the public toilet charged an entrance fee and charged more for washing clothes and brushing. There were two classes of toilets for gentlemen. The gentleman option and the regular option, they were advertised in the Times. The design, however, did not live long because this was prior to the Crackers flush. By the end of a public survey undertaken by the London School of Hygiene Tropical Medicine showed 281 public toilets were constructed prior to 1918, 178 during the war, and 71 built in 1940. By 1991, a total of 700 public toilets were available, of which only 350 accommodated people with disability and only 125 to accommodate those with infants. By the end of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s also added a layer of fear in sanitation and hygiene. By the end of the early 21st century, the public toilet had been associated with drug use, security issues, sexual activity, hygiene, and other trends that were considered illegal. The use of public toilets had dropped, and the number of toilets went from 486 in 2000 to 419 in 2004, but the actual numbers are much less because all these numbers that I'm stating, a lot of them also belong in parks. And even though the public toilet is sometimes public, the parks are sometimes closed, which doesn't make the toilets always accessible. And sometimes they are also closed. Also, the association with costs. A lot of the toilets that were implemented in the early 1800s, or like the mid 1800s, were easy to maintain because there was always a person supervising. Obviously, moving into the 21st century, that didn't seem like a feasible option, which contributed to the deterioration of the public toilet. With public health acts being incorporated in water and sewer, created a path for public toilets to be invented and reinvented as it was part of a larger scheme that was changing the city fabric. In 1990, the toilets were renovated as part of a conservation improvement done to the city because these toilets were considered, because they were designed in the Victorian and Edwardian style. By the 1990s, they were obviously more utilitarian. Automated public toilets were introduced. They were not as popular. In 2005, the general consensus was that there was a shortage of functioning public toilets in London. And by 2015, 50% of them had shut down. I will talk about this a little bit more in another slide, but London ended up improvising and providing a hybridized solution where it teamed up with private institutions. So the public has access to toilet facilities in restaurants and private facilities because they are being reimbursed by the government. But this also presents a very huge humanitarian issue as well. In 2008, I just wanted to highlight a toilet designed by plastic architects. They designed it as a centerpiece in a small city, and they incorporated a lot of like natural sunlight, colors, bright colors, and they were trying to bring back the charm of the public toilet, which I thought was a little endearing. In Paris, up until the 1930s, there had been over 1,200 pissoirs remaining scattered in the city of Paris, and they didn't begin to phase out until the 1960s. There only remains one Vespasien in Paris today, and it's managed by the Heritage Department of Paris Roads. By 1860, the Vespasien had become known as the Chalet de Nécessité, which were enclosed kiosks, and they also provided, they included women as well as men. Founded in 1964, the Déco, a French company that specialized in street furniture and other advertisements and bike rentals, also made automatic public toilets, and they supplied over 300 countries, including London and New York. In 1981, automated public toilets known as the sanitation were implemented in Paris, and those took over because they were now barrier-free, and they had become more environmentally friendly, recycling their water with skylights, and they were self-cleaning, but they were also designed to protect from drug use and prostitution. In New York in 1901, the first underground subway station opened in the 21st century. In the 20th century, the public toilet started to become incorporated in transportation buildings, including mostly incorporated in the subway in New York. This marked the beginning of a widespread appearance of public toilets. By 1940, there had been 1,600 public toilets in New York, but they were mostly incorporated in transportation stations, which means they weren't really accessible. It sounds like a big number, but there wasn't that many. There's not that many that are actually available. The Déco, the French company, was also introduced around this time in New York as well, but there were so few that were implemented that they didn't really resolve any real issue. In 2010, a survey found 129 public toilets, of which only 60 were available. And New York NYPD issues roughly 17,000 urination citations each year. So it's a huge issue still in New York. An organization called STALD, if you look to the floor plan image, is an open source research effort on the issues of public toilets and access, particularly pertaining to identity and access, while considering many different cultural demographics. It is conducted by a team of cross-disciplinary backgrounds, including architects and epidemiologists, as well as other humanitarian backgrounds. STALD has designed a prototype public toilet facility that accommodates like a wide range of public toilets, which you would refer to as the, which this is what I'm So that brings me to the end of my analysis. But I also wanted to highlight other issues that I won't be diving in today, but some of the things that I also considered while doing this research. And they were human rights issues for women, for people of color, people with disability, the LGBTQI community, and with the homeless community, and of course with Earth, because right now the way we use water is very abusive in a way, because we contaminate fresh water when we could be using other sources. And I wanted to close with, actually before I close, sorry, not closing it. Just to bring you up to speed on some of the issues that, some of the things happening currently. A lot of the public toilet provisions are going digitally since, as I explained earlier, they're becoming more privatized and embedded in other establishments. So this opens up a lot of opportunities for private facilities to become part of it and to go online. However, this can present itself as an issue when it comes to humanitarians, on a humanitarian front, because it is an urban, it's an exterior urban condition that's being interiorized. And I think that's very important to note. So provision is going digital, but is also going open source. So there's a lot of information out there on what inclusion or public provision should look like. Adapting to the 21st century, obviously we're going through COVID, which changes the landscape of everything, because in the beginning of my research, pre-COVID, the findings showed that the issues of public provision did not relate to hygiene, and now it absolutely does. And World Toilet Day, obviously we're here because of World Toilet Day, was coined by the UN and created to build awareness around the issues of public toilet, and not in terms of the public toilet that I'm speaking about, but in undeveloped countries and just all over the world. And I will leave you with a quote that I think tries to capture everything that I'm trying to say today. And Barbara Penner writes on the bathroom, and she refers to the toilet as an object of technology. So here technology is referenced to the toilet. And she writes, society and technology are bound in overlapping and intertwined networks that mutually shape each other. And I hope moving forward, you consider the toilet in that way. Questions?
I have a quick question if I could ask. What kind of a design, have you looked at any designs for toilets or have any thoughts yourself about what that might look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually submitted a design for a competition recently, just about a month ago. And it was a public toilet that was also a yoga studio. And my argument was like, I could pull it up probably, but it's okay. But I was arguing for a space that provides serenity and congested spaces, but also a place where toilets are like individual pods, because I really like the idea of a public toilet as a freestanding object that's sculptural. And to me, that's very appealing. So in my design, that's what I presented. And it was, it retained its water and we used its water consumption. Obviously, that's what you would strive for or hope for in any design.
That's super cool. It reminds me of the Bryant Park bathroom, if you're familiar with it. It's right next to the New York Public Library, and it's one of the most serene public bathrooms. Like, they were playing like classical music, they have fresh flowers constantly, a bathroom attendant who's super friendly, and like really, really nice furniture. So like I want to just go in there and like read a book. It's like, it
Right.
smells great, it's awesome. I feel like that would be so perfect, and there's no crime at all. And before they renovated the park, I don't know how much the bathroom had to do with it, but I imagine a lot, since it's a private space. But there's next to no crime there anymore, and as a woman, it feels really, really enjoyable, and I don't feel like my safety is at risk or anything. But that's really cool. I think like with
Absolutely.
like women's issues and people experiencing homelessness, like those two come together in like the bathroom, basically, or spaces like that.
And the bathroom will always be on the forefront of change and contentious issues, because it's so utilitarian in nature that these issues are impossible to escape. And that's why I really think it's important that architects and designers are drawn back into the subject, because the research really reveals how little we have a say in the development of the life of a public toilet. So if we came into the conversation early and said, this is what we can do, I think we can actually make real change happen. I know it sounds corny, but that was the whole intent of my research, was to draw attention to the subject.
Yeah, back when I was in design school a while ago, I had an instructor tell me not to focus so much on the toilet design in a commercial building, and don't try to reinvent the wheel, and just kind of take what's minimum minimally required and just like apply it. And I'm just really curious if that mentality is still going on today, because there's so many issues like you highlighted at the end. And you mentioned that a lot of females are drawn into this research naturally. And so I also wonder if, that is an opinion, a differing opinion between genders of if more progression needs to happen or not.
I think statistically, I think about 90% of researchers in this subject are women. So that's not an opinion. I would have to reference where I got that from, but yeah, I would say it's up there. So the number is too extreme to ignore, to even like speculate that it would be different. So I feel pretty confident saying that it is primarily a women's issue. Sorry, what was your next question?
We actually have a question in the chat.
Yes.
Have you looked at prefab toilets? What do you think we need to focus on when designing toilets challenged societies like in slums?
Actually, this is a very good question. Thank you, Munira. So I actually wrote an essay on like sustainability and ways we can be sustainable in slums before we implement our technology that's not very sustainable. And in Vancouver, Vancouver is very like advanced. They have the best of everything. And they have composting toilets for their public toilets, which I think is phenomenal. And they separate the waste and they use them. And I think this is great. And I might go off on a tangent, but to answer your question, yes, we can implement better sustainable solutions in slum areas. But also, if you think about it, today's issues revolve a lot around data collection. And when you are defecating, you are actually leaving physical raw material of your data. And in sewage places in London, actually, they can tell how the city is feeling based on their waste level, the level of toxicity and medication in the waste. So they know on weekends, alcohol level and drug level is high. They also predicted that after Brexit, there was a high level of people on antidepressants. So these are information that they're getting from your waste. And I feel like at some point in our time, we're going to go to a public toilet and we're going to ask, can I have my information? Like, I don't know. I'm just speculating. Like, these are things that I think about, that I think, it would be nice if we all thought about them.
That reminds me, I think it was the University of Arizona that was using public toilet and waste research to do contact tracing for COVID.
Wow, yeah. Yeah.
On campus. So
that's crazy.
Isolate certain dorm buildings based on what they would find in the waste. They would know if there was a higher amount.
Right. And that's a humanitarian issue. Like, who does your information belong to?
Right. So question, the term picking the flowers or picking a flower, where do you know where exactly that came from or why it's called that, or
Yeah, so I can look it up for you. It's been a while, but so they would form a circle and to disguise what they were doing. And I love this because if you think about it now, when girls still go together to the washroom, and this is something that dates way back, but to disguise what they were actually doing, they would pretend they were picking flowers, and they'd go, picking a flower while one person was going about their business. So all, like, let's say 5 girls were picking the flowers and the one in the middle was like pooping. Yeah, but yeah. Thank you for asking that.
You also mentioned, I think it was in 1872 when you showed the drawing, I think pretty much of the modern toilet design, that you said this is basically when toilets stopped being designed. Yeah. So could you explain what you mean by design in that sense, and then really, why you say that?
Because like, as I was doing the research, the time frames between, like in the 1800s, between like when the toilet design was changing was not that significant. And if you look at the toilet design from that year, it really hasn't changed much in terms of what toilet we use today. Even though there are many, like I just gave the example of the composting public toilets, those are only available every few far in between. They're not the norm. And to think about it, we're from 1872, we're in 2020, and we're still using the same kind of design. And now, especially when you think of hygiene, this is kind of also going off on a tangent. We've come to a point where we've designed the public interior design of the toilet to be almost entirely hands-free. Yet the part that we most touch, and that's mostly not sanitary, is the toilet, yet we still have full contact with it. And I would implore you to question that as to why everything is wireless, or not wireless, handless, but we still consider the toilet to be grounded. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about how a toilet would work without having full contact, specifically for females.
So hence the yoga studio.
Oh, yes.
That's where I was going with it. I don't know. It's very speculative. I was just having fun with it. But I mean, if we start thinking about these things, then maybe we can actually think about a tangible solution that doesn't involve yoga. But
I also found it fascinating that in New York, they considered the indoor plumbing essentially to be less hygienic.
right.
And what is it? And they would prefer to like still put it outside. Why is that? And what caused that belief versus in Europe when they were making strides on a hygiene front?
Right. I don't know how to answer that, but I think from the research I found that like there was an actual publication on the speculation that wasn't necessarily true. And I think that really drove the point. And I think I would assume that's partially why, but it is a good question. I would have to look into it.
Yeah. Makes me, also think like how important it is that we always question where we get our information.
Right. Right.
The literature and, who's the researcher and who's the faculty, where is everything coming from before just assuming that's the way it is.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any other questions for Allaa? And feel free to type them in the chat as well.
Yeah. I can talk all day about toilets.
So what are some of the obstacles facing public toilets today? I know you mentioned that, they're going into kind of private spaces. And so that responsibility is put on private, organizations. But there's always a need for public toilets. I mean, you kind of mentioned prostitution as well. Are these still issues, like issues of safety? Is this what's prohibiting us from having, more advanced public toilets in cities?
I wouldn't say crime is the reason, but I think over the past 50 years of crime and of diseases, and there are incremental problems that have piled up over the years that haven't been addressed at all. And I think that's part of the reason why we need to be in the conversation, because these little factors are coming in and changing the way we use the toilet and our perception of it, and they're creating serious problems because provision is a necessity. It's not an option. You need public provision. And so if we are able to answer and address these these questions early on before they're reaching a legislation level or an infrastructure level. If we can come in and provide architectural solutions, I think we would have better public toilets all the way through. But I don't think it's a single problem. But I think what we're presented with today, COVID is really going to help in terms of how we perceive hygiene and sanitation. Just like the cholera pandemic, most of the changes happened right after the pandemic, and there was a few outbreaks that led to so many legislations that led to today's toilet. So hopefully, in light of everything that's happening, we will see better changes for the public toilet, and I'm very hopeful. And I think right now it's gaining a lot of momentum. Like I said, this research was written a couple of years ago, but it's only now that it's starting to gain traction and people are interested, which speaks a lot. And thank you, Mira, you're very welcome. Stephanie, are there specific custom designs that promote rape? So, Stephanie, are there specific hostile designs or public bathrooms that promote rape or sex trafficking? So when I first started working in the professional world, I was quite surprised to know that the design of the public toilet of any public facility requires your site of view to be visible from the, not to be visible from the exterior, which I thought was very weird, because in a weird way, it helps predators. If they're going to do something, then it's helping them, protect them from the outside. Like, I don't see it as beneficial. I see it as the opposite. But no, I don't think there's like usually when you are designing a toilet, the general rule of thumb is eyes on the streets, like when it comes to any kind of public toilet. So you avoid corners, you avoid sheltered areas. I mean, same way you would treat any kind of like high sensitive area, like a school or whatever. That school is a bad example, but yeah, that answers your question. I don't know about sex trafficking. That's outside of my house. But thank you for that. That was an interesting question.
Yeah, I hadn't, I guess, really put it together until I was watching you speak and seeing the pictures of people continually putting their waste out through their window, that we often think about like the front door as the threshold between the, the urban or exterior realm and the interior realm. But really it's sort of plumbing and like the toilet and the flow of waste is also a direct link from the interior to the exterior. Yeah. So I find that as a really interesting dynamic to be kind of looked in, maybe theoretically. What does that mean?
I mean, when you think about it, it makes you question everything you know about design, because you think, how am I I'm a designer, and how can I think of a space like this? And like, I'm producing all this waste in fresh water, and then it's going out into more fresh water. But yeah, there's light at the end of the tunnel. Hopefully composting toilets for everyone.
I was working on a project locally with the city to install green infrastructure into low-income neighborhoods. And one of the things that we were implementing was composting toilets. And we cannot, for the life of us, find a plumber willing to work on the project. Or the ones that are, like, I guess, qualified or, want to do that are booked for like 2 years out.
So was that like, were you working with a contractor or?
No, it was straight through the city of Grand Rapids, and then an environmental nonprofit. And so it was kind of like no specific contractor.
Right. Yeah, actually, that's a very good point. Something I probably don't think of enough, because even if you want to implement these changes, who's going to do it, right? And if your plumber isn't doing, like, yeah, it requires like a lot of, I mean, we do need to promote promote public toilets a little bit more. And like designers, you know, a bylaw isn't really gonna really instigate any, like spark any like change on the social front that's going to be like impactful on an individual kind of level. But if you can do that through design, then maybe I don't know if you're following, but like just saying that, you know, these solutions require architectural solutions and not like a top-down solution. Because, for example, what I'm trying to say is like in London, the top-down approach is, okay, these private facilities are providing public provision for everyone. But then who's to say the private owner is not stopping certain individuals, certain demographics from entering their washroom? Or what is in that space that's making people uncomfortable or comfortable to go in? Like these are things that if it was provided by the government, we would be able to control, because it would all be regulated in a different kind of setting, even though like signs would be regulated and everything. But there are nuances that you can't control when it comes to private provision.
So designers have a real agency here.
Yes, absolutely. I think we can do great things.
Yeah, and use our expertise to talk to our clients and, you know, people that we present to and interact with.
Right.
Spread the word.
I mean, so I can give you a few examples from my professional career. When I was working professionally, the toilet was never really a topic of discussion, and in any of my experiences, it was always on the background. But actually, in the last 3 projects that I worked on, one of them was a fire station, and we designed a gender-neutral shower and locker, and it was in Essex County. Maybe you think this is a county, like they're going with a gender-neutral washroom, but the reason they did it was they were just trying to save on space. But you know, we had this conversation with them, and we discussed it with them, and we really convinced them that, you know, it wasn't such a big deal, and they went with it, and they saved so much space in their building, and they have a lot more space to use for other rooms other than, you know, having 2 of each. And so that one worked out. And then I have another example of a toilet where it's a public building, but the washrooms function year round. So it's actually a building, but also a public toilet within the building. So that changed the dynamic of how the entire building was structured, and it changed the whole conversation with the clients because a lot of the design changed. And they were excited about the washroom being able to be this thing that could stand alone and still operate without the building operating. And then we implemented also a similar project on a gallery space where the washroom was accessible both from inside the building and outside, so that it would close off during private functions and then opened up, which I thought was a very clever solution, because, you know, you're able to provide public provision while still using it for private events. And there was ways we worked around that. If you're interested, I can pull up the examples, but some other time. Yeah. But yeah, these conversations happening, like they're little conversations that start, but we don't even have those. So if we don't have those, how do we expect anything to change? And I mean, even if it's just suggesting it to a client, because if a client wants it, then I'm sure we can find a contractor that will do it, right? So.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful presentation and discussions.
Thank you for having me. This is very exciting. I'm always excited to talk about this.
Great. Yeah, I don't want to use up too much of your time because we're already at 2:18.
Right.
So are there any final comments or questions from anybody before we close out the session?
Well, I hope you all enjoyed it.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Okay. Bye, everybody.
References.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Here we go.
Any references? Yes. I'd love to share. Actually, my library is right behind me. There is the father of all bathroom books, Alexander Kira. He conducted a very, very thorough study on how we use the washroom, our bodies, how they react. And this was back in the 70s, but it's still one of the most comprehensive books written on public toilets, which I recommend. Clara Greed is a really good author that I constantly reference. There's Barbara Penner. Those are probably the three most that I've referenced, I think. There's also Designing for Diversity by Catherine, I think, by Catherine Anthony. She's also very good. There is Mary Douglas, Purity and Danger. This kind of goes more into the psychology of the space, which is very interesting, but trying to write a thesis on this topic was very, very challenging, so I steered ship instantly. Yeah, I would start with Kira, to be quite honest, but those three were. And Koolhaas, he doesn't have much. Is it possible? Yeah, absolutely. I can forward. Kim, is it okay if I forward it to you?
Absolutely. And then I can distribute it to the attendee list.
Sure.
Because I couldn't write down what you were saying fast.
Oh, sorry.
No. Some of those books look really fascinating, and I'm sure you have more too. So, yeah.
Well,
yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do I leave now? I just want to say thank you again, Kim.
Yeah.
This is really